In this lesson, I talk about the ad hominem argument, or nasty personal attacks. This is the second part of the nasty climate tactic discussion that I started with discussion of the appeal to hypocrisy. And it's also the fourth and last of the tactics that we commonly encounter in climate negotiations when people are in the denial, anger, and depression stages of the climate grief cycle. The objectives of this lesson are to gain familiarity with the ad hominem fallacy or tactic, recognize how it can crop up in climate negotiation, and finally to develop an understanding of what we can do about it when we do encounter it. So what is the ad hominem argument? It's avoiding discussion of a topic by attacking the character, motive, or other attribute of the person making the argument. So in this way, it avoids discussing the substance of the argument itself. And it's all too common in climate negotiation. The objective of the ad hominem argument is to derail the discussion, to make us respond with anger, resort to conflict in the discussion, to remove any chance of agreement, and end all meaningful discussion. And it's necessarily mean, and it's very nasty. Because we're all human, and so it's hard not to take the bait, to fall into the trap. We all have emotions, and it's easy to be offended when somebody attacks some personal attribute of ours rather than staying on topic and discussing about the issue at hand. And this is especially the case if there's no factual basis for the attack. I mean, if it's just not true at all, which often is the case in ad hominem argument because the people who use it don't feel constrained by facts or by truth. And also the other time when it can be really nasty is when there's no linkage between the attack and the discussion at hand. So, in fact, all of a sudden we're talking about my racial background and not about climate change. I mean, who cares? It takes two common basic forms. The first is poisoning the well. This is what I call the damned if I do, damned if I don't type of argument. If we defend ourselves, it proves the point. But at the same time, if we remain silent, it implies tacit agreement. Classic example of this. When did you stop beating your wife? The second form of the ad hominem argument is the genetic fallacy. That is, discrediting the source of the argument discredits the argument. This is an attack on race, or creed, or even profession. An example that we encounter oftentimes in climate work is, you're a scientist. You're only in this for the money. Well, you'll note that we're trying to discredit a discussion of climate science by arguing that the person who is making the argument is a scientist. So in fact, they're by necessity a scientist, and that means that everything they have to say about it is wrong. So the genetic fallacy is actually quite slippery, and as I said, it's quite mean. Now, in all of this, these are irrelevant arguments, and neither tactic is relevant to climate discussion. They're both nasty, they're both personal, and the intent, as I said, is to make us angry. And when we do get angry, they win. Just recall and just remember, character, origin, or racial background have no bearing on the truth. But I think the thing to take away from all of that is that even though the attack can hurt our feelings, it doesn't prove us wrong. So I'm returning again to Greta Thunberg as an example. Greta can say, read the science, listen to the scientists, and take action. And I've heard all too often people saying, and this was all over social media late last year, Greta Thunberg is not qualified to talk about climate change, she's too young. Or she's a victim of child abuse and that disqualifies her. Or she doesn't respect her elders and that disqualifies her. Well, I'd like to evaluate that example for just a moment. I mean, this was all over social media last year. But if you think about it, none of the noise has any bearing on the argument. It doesn't prove one way or the other whether climate change or the science is true or false. It's just an attack on Greta's person. And, climate change is real no matter how often we go about attacking Greta. And it was intended to do three things. Change the topic, so we're no longer talking about climate change because that's difficult. We're talking about Greta, and we're playing a little blame game with Greta. It's kind of like gossip, and that's the point. The second thing is to intimidate. If we make it really unpleasant for people like Greta, they may just go away, and then we won't have to deal with them. And finally, people do it to stoke egos. This is an actual bullying behavior. And so when people do it, they do it to make themselves feel great. But, making the discussion about Greta doesn't make climate change crisis go away. But as I said, it can be difficult to defend. It's hard to fend it off. That's one of the reasons why they're so popular. And it's really, really easy to be offended, fall into the trap. Now, we can, if we're careful, diffuse the conflict. We can ignore the attack and patiently return the discussion to the evidence. For example, for the wife-beating attack, we could say something like, "My relationship with my wife has no bearing on this discussion. Let's get back on topic." But it's tricky, because sometimes the ad hominem argument contains some truth. For example, if I say, "You're a scientist," well, that actually might be true. "You're only in it for the money." Well, that might be partially true. We all need to make a living, and I expect that any scientist who's working at science expects to get their paycheck at the end of the month. And then they add, "And that makes you corrupt and can't be trusted." Well, in my experience, that's likely not true, and in fact, it's just mean. And as I've said many times before, watch out for the trolls. Let's just focus on average folks. What are they really worried about? Can we find the common ground? And remember, they may repeat the ad hominem argument in their discussions with us because it's easy to understand, it's convenient because it's all over the place, and they hear it often in social media. So we need to help them through that. This demands patience, and that is the key factor in dealing with ad hominem arguments that I found over the years, is avoid anger, be patient, and return the discussion to the topic at hand. So here are our do's and don'ts. We have to open listen, just as we always have. We have to be really patient. We have to stay on topic and understand our own position. What's our core message? Can we repeat it, go back to it? And do find the common ground. What's underneath all of this? Why are people concerned? Why don't they want to hear our core message? What is going on in there, and how can we find a common ground to build on? Now, just like all the other denial, anger, depression tactics, this is still not the time to offer up facts and figures. All that's going to happen is they're going to respond with anger. But it's really, really critical here that we don't yield to the temptation to fight. Just go back and restate your original argument, your core message, and don't get distracted into arguments about your character. Now, we return to the fallacies we consider. Still common, open listening, patience, understanding your position, your core message, seeking common ground. What we add in terms of unique responses here is, for the ad hominem argument, we add, stay on topic. This really is a temptation to move away from the discussion at hand and get into a discussion of all these other peripheral issues, some of which may not even be true and can be a very interesting diversion and waste of time. So what did we cover? Well, we considered the ad hominem fallacy as a tactic in climate negotiations. We thought about where it could crop up in climate negotiations, especially with a reference to the stuff that's gone on with Greta Thunberg, but I'm sure we can all think of examples of our own. And then we thought about what we could do about it. Let's carry on the discussion in the comments below. If you have anything to add, please feel free to contribute in that way. I'll review it and we'll share it with the other participants of the course and carry on with the discussion.